I'm here. Doesn't sound like I'm very loud, though. Let's try that. Hello? Up. And we're testing volume. That's better. Okay, there I am. Now it's better. Good, good. All right, so when we were here, oh my gosh, and it's falling off my ear. Don't fall off my ear. I'll just squeeze it until my ear falls off. Okay, when we were here on Monday, we were talking about externalities, and I said that at the very end, I said we have negative externalities, and the private market left to its own devices produces too much of those things. We have positive externalities. The private market left to its own devices produces too few of those things that generate positive externalities, and that leads to calls for government intervention, which we're going to look at in just a minute. But there are some cases under which there is no need for government intervention, and that's what's characterized by the Coase theorem, which is named for Ron Coase, who's an economist/lawyer, so law and economics professor, who came up with this in the first place. And what Coase said was, if there are three conditions that are satisfied, then we don't need government intervention to address the fact that the social optimum and the private optimum are different. One of those conditions is well-defined property rights. If it's really clear who owns whatever's involved in this transaction, and who doesn't? That is one of the three conditions that allows for solution without government intervention. Second, if there are no or at least low costs to bargaining. So if the cost of bargaining with the other person is zero or at least really small, I mean, maybe it's like you have to go and be nice to somebody. That's a small cost, hopefully no cost. Then that's the second condition. And the third condition is that there are only a few people involved in the transaction. In those cases, when all three of those conditions are satisfied, well-defined property rights, no or at least small costs to bargaining, and only a few people involved, then the solution, the fact that the private optimum is not equal to the social optimum in the presence of externalities, the solution to the externalities problem can be achieved without government intervention. So, let's see, what do we have? We had an example last time about cow football games and how many additional people are brought in with the cow football games. That generates positive externalities for all the stores and restaurants in town. That's a lot of people, right? So that's not going to be subject to the Coase theorem because it violates the only a few people sort of example. An example which is probably it's on some exercise someplace, or maybe it's even in the book. We had, where I lived, there was a tree that was right on the property line between our house and the neighbor's house. It was a humongous tree, and it dropped all sorts of crud onto our house and into our drainage system, and so I was spending like $1,000 every season to have the Roto-Rooter people come out and clean out the sewage system and the drainage system because of all the crud off of this tree. So that's a problem, because my neighbor's tree had this negative externality. That should be, you should be able to do this without government intervention, just by going to the neighbor and saying, hey, look, you've got this tree, it's right on the property line. Technically, yes, it's on your line, but most of the tree is hanging over my house. I've got all this crud, it's spending $1,000 a year. We need to do something about the tree. Unfortunately, the neighbor that we had when this problem started 20 years ago was an alcoholic lawyer who worked at home, who was a bully. So one time he was like nursing a hangover and trying to talk on the phone, and the gardening people came and they were running that thing with the blower, and he came out and like started to ready to hit the guy. So that's an impediment to bargaining. Okay, so that meant there was a really high cost to bargaining, and it wasn't possible to achieve a solution because in that case it was clear who owned the tree. He owned the tree. There were only a few people, me and Art, but there was a really high cost to bargaining. The guy was a creep. He moved. Yay! We got new neighbors. Yay! They're very nice. All right. If those conditions are not satisfied, then government intervention is necessary in order to solve the externalities problem. So here's a real clicker question. Which of the following externality problems could probably be solved without government intervention? So which of these things lends itself to the Coase theorem? A, refineries in Richmond pollute the air. B, your roommate's loud music inhibits your studying or his use of the megaphone. C, your education benefits society. D, the noisy football crowd disturbs the neighbors who bought houses above the stadium. Knowing the stadium was there, but nevertheless. E, I don't know. A, B, C, D, or E. 3 seconds, because you're all nailing this one. 1, 2, and 3. Good. All right, what do we got? Oh, lovely. 94%. Happy face. So the problem with the first one is there are way too many parties, and it's not clear who owns the rights to the air. So it's not well-defined property rights and lots of people, that being the population of Richmond. Your education benefits society. Again, you have the right to your education. The property rights are clear, but there's a lot of people in society. The noisy football crowd disturbs the neighbors. Too many people involved. Not a small number of parties. All right, Coase theorem. So let's look at what happens when we do try to either encourage behavior with subsidies or discourage behavior with taxes. So I did send out a tweet this morning. I uploaded new slides. There's a couple of new slides here that were not there last night. This is one of them. All right. So the private market produces too little if there's some activity that has positive externalities. That's the thing that we saw yesterday, and I'm going to redraw the graph when I get to the next slide. And one way that the government or some sort of agency that operates like a government can encourage behavior that has positive externalities is through subsidies. So here's an example from my own life. I get a $48 BART ticket every month that I pay for with payroll deduction. So it's $48 that comes. It's a $48 BART ticket that I get every month for commuting, and it's deducted from my pay before taxes, which means I don't have to pay taxes on the money that I pay for this BART ticket. Well, $3 of this $48 is paid by BART. So they actually only charge me $45 for a $48 BART card. That means it's actually paid by all of the taxpayers who live in the 9-county BART system. That's a subsidy. So everybody who lives in the 9-county BART system is subsidizing my purchase of BART tickets. Makes it cheaper for me. The university pays $10 because if I commute by BART, that's one less car that's coming to campus, which means one less car needing to find a parking place, which should lower the demand for parking lots, which should over time make it necessary to build fewer additional parking lots. So that's another subsidy. It's a $10 subsidy paid by the university who benefits because of this lower need for building parking lots. $10 of it is paid effectively by the federal government because it's pre-taxes, and so it lowers my federal taxes by $10. So the whole country's people are subsidizing my purchase of BART tickets, and $3 is paid by the state. So $3 is covered by the taxpayers in the state of California, which means for a $48 BART ticket, I pay only $22 a month. That's an example of subsidizing behavior that we want to encourage. We want to encourage people to commute to campus on public transit, not to drive to campus. And so there's a series of subsidies which lowers the private cost of commuting by, in this case, by BART, same example if I were to take AC transit, and thereby leads to more people taking public transit and fewer people driving than would be the case if there wasn't such a subsidy. All right, let's look at the graphs. So I think the easier way to do this, which is not the way it's done in the book because I only figured this out last semester, is to have two graphs and I've stacked them one on top of the other. So this is where there's a little change from what you printed out if you printed out the slides last night. The top graph is going to be the graph where we look at the effect of the externality. So this is going to be the same as the graph that we had on Monday. We've got things measured in dollars on the vertical axis, things and the quantity on the horizontal axis. And the bottom graph is going to be where we show the effect of a subsidy. So again, things measured in dollars on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. The externality graph, remember, for a positive externality looked like this. We've got some downward sloping private marginal benefit, which if this was some product like a BART card, we could just think of as a demand curve. And I'm going to redraw that same downward sloping curve in my lower graph. So the private marginal benefit, or what is simply demand, is there in the bottom graph. So I'm trying to draw exactly the same graph in exactly the same position. We've got some upward sloping marginal cost curve. And I'm going to try to draw the same graph in the bottom graph, same line in the bottom graph. So I've got some upward sloping marginal cost, which is the marginal cost of providing whatever this product is. And that would give us the private optimum, the private equilibrium would be where those two things intersect. We'll call it Q sub P in the externality graph which would be sold at a price P sub P up there. And I'm just going to use slightly different labels. I'll call it Q sub 1 in the bottom graph and price 1 in the bottom graph. But price 1 and P sub P should be the same thing, and quantity 1 and Q sub P should be the same thing. Those things should be equal. So it should be that we've got P1 equals the private price and Q1 equals the private quantity. In the existence of a positive externality, that positive externality means there's some marginal external benefit, and the marginal external benefit, MEB for marginal external benefit, shifts up that private marginal benefit curve by the amount of that marginal external benefit, giving us a new social marginal benefit curve, which is the sum of the private marginal benefit and the marginal external benefit. Same graph that we had on Monday. That means that taking into account the externality, the quantity that society would like to see would be where your social marginal benefit curve intersects your marginal cost curve, dash that down, call that QS for the socially optimal quantity, and it would be sold at a price of PS for the socially optimal price. Well, how do we encourage people to buy a higher quantity and pay a higher market price? Well, if we provide the buyers with a subsidy, like how they provide me with a lot of subsidies for buying these BART tickets, if we provide people with a subsidy, then that subsidy has the effect of shifting the demand curve up by the amount of the subsidy. And so we get some vertical shift here, which is the amount of the subsidy. And so the price that we're willing to pay to the seller, the $48 that I pay to the seller, the price that we're willing to pay to the seller is the initial demand curve plus the subsidy. And that gives us a new equilibrium quantity where that second demand curve crosses the first marginal cost, which is actually the supply curve. So find that, call it Q2. And the price the seller receives is price P2. But the subsidy lowers that cost to the consumer. So from price P2, drop down by the amount of the subsidy, which is just the distance between your two demand curves, and we'll dash that over, and we get price P2 minus the subsidy. So in the example of the BART card, P2 is $48, P2 minus the subsidy is the 22 out of pocket that I pay. So by providing a subsidy, that's going to increase the amount of the output that people want to purchase. It's going to move the market equilibrium from the initial market equilibrium Q1 to a higher market equilibrium. And if the subsidy is exactly equal to the marginal external benefit, if the subsidy is exactly equal to the marginal external benefit, then what we'll get is that the second market quantity, the quantity that people are choosing to purchase as a result of the provision of the subsidy, will equal the socially optimal quantity. So if the subsidy exactly equals the marginal external benefit, then the market will generate that socially optimal quantity. We'll allow people to internalize the externality and generate the ideal quantity. That's what it looks like for a positive externality. Let's think about it as well for a negative externality. And the question is always, what's the right size? So what's the right size of the subsidy? What's the right size of the tax? We just looked at the issue for the right size of the subsidy. Notice this is not normative analysis. So when we say what's the right size, we're talking about what's the right size that generates the socially optimal quantity. There's no normative stuff in here. This isn't about judgment. It's not about fairness. It's about what can we do in the market to generate a market equilibrium that equals the socially optimal equilibrium. Taxes. Taxes are used to discourage activity that generates negative externality. If the tax is too big, if the tax is bigger than the marginal damage cost, then that second quantity is going to be smaller than the socially optimal quantity. If the tax is too big, there'll be too little of this behavior relative to what society wants. If the tax is small, I feel like Goldilocks here. If the tax is too small, if the tax is below the marginal damage cost, then the second quantity will be too big. Second quantity will be larger than that socially optimal quantity. However, if and only if the tax is equal to the marginal damage cost, then we'll get the desired result that the second market equilibrium will be exactly equal to the social equilibrium. We will have fully internalized the externality. Does the tax eliminate the behavior? Not necessarily. We're not necessarily aiming for an elimination of the behavior. Taxes discourage behavior to move the quantity to that social optimum, but the social optimum may not be zero. So if we look at how to graph a negative externality, we get this. Again, things measured in dollars on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis, dollars on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal. Draw yourself a downward sloping marginal benefit curve. Draw the same curve in the bottom. Again, this is, if you printed out last night, you've got one set of axes, so just turn it into two. Up on the top, draw a private marginal cost curve. Draw the same curve on the bottom, marginal cost. Find the intersection of those initial two curves. We've got the private equilibrium price and quantity in both markets. We've got exactly the same thing in both markets. This is where the market would take us. I'm going to call it Q sub P and P sub P in the top. I could call it the same thing in the bottom if I wanted to, but I'm going to call it Q1 and P1 in the bottom graph just because it's fun to do so. We've got a negative externality here, so there is some marginal damage cost. And the marginal damage cost is that negative externality. We're going to take and add that marginal damage cost to the private marginal cost. And the sum of those two things gives us the social marginal cost, SMC. That's the same picture that we had on Monday. And you can find the intersection then of your social marginal cost and your marginal benefit curve. And that gives us the social equilibrium quantity and the social equilibrium price. Society wants to see less of goods that generate negative externalities, less pollution, less secondhand smoke, less annoying roommates with megaphones. If there's just a little, let's do this so that we have not the optimal tax. Add just a little itty bitty tax. So if we add just a little itty bitty tax on the bottom, so that we shift the marginal cost curve up by the amount of the tax, so we get the second, it's actually a supply curve, we could call it either one. The second supply curve, which is the sum of the initial supply curve and the tax. And that's going to, we've already seen this, that's going to generate some new quantity, Q2. Well, in this case, the tax is too small. So if you drew a little bitty tax, which was smaller than your marginal damage cost, the tax is too small because the tax is smaller than the marginal damage cost. And the result is that the new equilibrium quantity, while it's lower than the original equilibrium quantity, it's still bigger than what society wants to see. The optimal size of the tax would be to have a tax that just equaled the marginal damage cost. If we had a tax that was exactly equal to the MDC, then the tax would shift the supply curve up by the amount of the marginal damage cost, that is to say by the amount of the tax. The new market equilibrium would be Q2, which would be exactly equal to the social. All right, clicker question. So what's the effect of a tax or a penalty, because penalties are the same thing. In 2008, California implemented a fine, $76 plus a whole bunch of additional administrative costs. A fine for driving while holding a cell phone. As a result, the amount of driving while holding a cell phone should now be A, more than it would be without the tax or the fine, B, the same as it would be without the fine, C, less than it would be without the fine, D, no one holds a cell phone while driving, or E, I don't know. Because I know no one in this room would ever touch their cell phone while they were driving. Oh my God, she sounds like my mother. A, B, C, D, or E, 3 seconds. 1, 2, and 3. All right, good. So the effect of the fine increases the price of holding a cell phone while you're driving, and downward sloping demand curves, that's going to lead to a lower number of people who are willing to hold the phone while they're driving. 88% get the happy face. Only 1% of you said no one holds a cell phone while driving. You know this from observation. It's also a result of the fact that the fine is too small to completely eliminate the behavior. Suppose instead of $76, suppose the fine for driving while you're holding a cell phone is $10,000. If the fine for holding your cell phone while you're driving was $10,000, you think that would lead to fewer people holding onto their cell phones while they drove? Yeah, right? So the bigger the fine, the smaller the amount of behavior. So when is it that a zero amount of this behavior is socially optimal? Stuff in dollars on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal. This time I want your marginal benefit curve to be way down. So draw your marginal benefit curve in the lower half of your graph. Start it really low. So suppose this is some activity. There's the marginal benefit of that activity. Draw a private marginal cost curve on there. There's a marginal cost. I want this way down in the bottom quadrant of your upper quadrant. And so we would have some socially optimal quantity, QP, there we go, at some socially optimal price. Some private optimal quantity, QP, at the private optimal price, P sub P. When is Q equals 0 optimal? When the marginal damage cost is so big that the private marginal cost plus the marginal damage cost, which equals, as we know, the social marginal cost, results in no intersection between the social marginal cost and the marginal benefit curve. So draw a second social marginal cost curve that's up so high that it never crosses your marginal benefit curve. So you want such a big marginal damage cost that there's no intersection between your marginal benefit curve and your social marginal cost curve. So that's the marginal damage cost, is that distance between the two. The sum of the two is the social marginal cost. And notice the way that I've drawn it, and hopefully the way that you've drawn it, there's no intersection here between the marginal benefit curve and the social marginal cost curve. That's the only time when a quantity of 0 is optimal. The only time we as society want to have a large enough tax or penalty to completely eliminate a behavior is when there's no remaining intersection between the private marginal cost, between the social marginal cost and the marginal benefit curve. That's the only time. Rest of the time, driving, quantity equals 0, no, that's not socially optimal. We don't want to see nobody drive. Smoking, we don't really want to have taxes high enough to completely eliminate the behavior. A few people smoking off in the corner doesn't generate so much secondhand smoke, and so on. All right, let's do this the other way then. Let's think about this from the perspective of how big do you think the damage cost is. Let's take an example you know well from classes like this one. Talking in class generates negative externalities. We know that, right? Because if the people in front of you or behind you are chattering, it's harder to hear what I'm saying. What's the optimal penalty for talking in class? A, the professor simply ignores it and does nothing. B, the professor says, do you have a question? C, the professor publicly humiliates the people who are talking. D, the professor screams at the entire class, but doesn't say anything directly to the people who are talking. Or E, the prof randomly chooses A, B, C, or D, or a different reaction each time. There's no right answer. It's what do you think? What do you think is the optimal penalty for people yakety in a large enrollment class? 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. There you go. So here's what you think. 4% of you think the professor should do nothing and just ignore it. That means that 4% of you think that there is no marginal damage cost from the people around you chatting. 31% gave B. Do y'all have a question? Can I help you? So an intervention, but not a humiliating one. 47% think the marginal damage cost is higher and that the professor should publicly humiliate those people who are talking in class. 4% put the marginal damage cost really high and think the penalty should be really big, which would be screaming at the whole class instead of just publicly humiliating or intervening with the others. And 15% like the random approach. Your answer should reflect how big you think the marginal damage cost is. The optimal penalty is one where the penalty equals the marginal damage cost. So your answer to this question is a reflection of what you think the marginal damage cost of this particular activity is. All right, so that's one approach to addressing negative externalities, is fines and penalties. There's another approach which is called cap and trade. Under the cap and trade system, cap and trade is a market-based solution that addresses negative externalities. Under cap and trade, there's some authority. This is usually used with regard to pollution. There's some authority that determines the total allowable pollution. That's the cap. So the authority issues some permits that are permission to pollute permits. And for each unit of pollution, that's usually measured by CO2, or I don't know how I'm not a scientist. It's measured somehow. The scientists know how to do this. One permit is required for each unit of pollution that's generated. The trade part is these permits can be bought and sold. So say 3 permits are issued to each manufacturer. If the manufacturer is a really clean manufacturer and is not polluting, they can sell their permits to somebody else. If the manufacturer is a really dirty manufacturer and is doing a lot of pollution, they need to buy some permits from somebody else. So the key assumption for the cap and trade system to lead to a reduction in pollution and generate some revenue is that manufacturers face different costs of reducing their pollution. So that's a key assumption behind this approach. And the characteristic of this cap and trade system is that the price of these permits are going to fluctuate. They're going to vary with supply and demand. So more supply is going to lower the price of the permits. More demand is going to raise the price of the permits. And the implication of that is that as the pollution cap is reduced over time, that's going to force up the price of the permits, and the firms will then have an economic incentive to pay to install some sort of pollution controls in their own company rather than buy the permits. Now, I've taught this a few years, and it's never made a whole lot of sense to people, so we're going to try a different approach. We're going to take it and look at telebears. So we're going to think about telebears as a cap and trade system. Certainly there's a cap on telebears. You all know phase 1's coming up, starts October 20th. The negative externality. If we didn't have the system we have now, there are people who would sign up for 20 units as soon as telebears opens, which wouldn't leave very many classes for the rest of you. So the negative externality that's involved in signing up for classes is if somebody grabs like a whole lot of classes on the very first day, then the people who have late appointments don't have very good classes to choose from, and they're not going to necessarily get the classes they want. And so we have a cap, right? You can only sign up for 10 and a half if you count the PE, but I'm going to cut off the PE because I don't want the halves floating around my example.